When we imagine the ancient world, we usually default to a stereotypical version of opulence. We see golden palaces and legendary heroes feasting on roasted meat, living in a state of constant, unearned extravagance. But the reality was a collection of constant biological threats. To survive, you had to navigate scorching heat, secure scarce calories, and endure crowded cities where disease was a daily neighbor. Ancient peoples met these challenges with specialized survival strategies. They engineered methods to protect their bodies and manage their limited resources with precision. These strategies were so effective that they eventually transformed into the foundations of high-status culture. These ancient practices functioned as high-stakes biological and economic hacks disguised beneath a layer of ceremony. The unglamorous reality of the Greek diet was built on bread. Survival depended on dense barley bread, a hard, unrefined grain that tolerated poor soil and provided the heavy calories needed for manual labor. Meat was a rare luxury because livestock functioned as a living bank account. A goat produced milk and cheese. A sheep produced wool. These were compounding assets paying daily dividends. Slaughtering an animal for a casual meal meant destroying a family's long-term economic security. This changes how we read Homer's descriptions of heroes eating roasted oxen and drinking wine. These scenes represent rare, high-stakes flexes of wealth and hospitality. They signal that a host owns enough livestock to sacrifice a major asset just to feed a stranger. Even the drinking was a form of crowd control. Civilized Greeks strictly diluted their wine with water, often at a ratio of 3-to-1. This allowed for hours of poetry and conversation without the risk of an entire banquet turning into a drunken riot. The legendary Greek feast was a display of economic dominance and social engineering, used to maintain order in a world of scarcity. In ancient Egypt, the primary threat was the sun. Surviving the extreme heat of the Nile Valley required a specialized wardrobe, long before it became a fashion statement. Egyptians stayed cool by wearing ultra-breathable linen made from the flax plant. They also frequently shaved their heads bald to prevent heat stroke and to remove the breeding grounds for head lice in crowded homes. But a bare scalp is vulnerable to severe sunburn. The elaborate Egyptian wig provided a breathable, protective layer of insulation against the sun, while the quality of the hair and the gold bands signaled the wearer's rank. Even the iconic eyeliner served a medical purpose. This dark coal powder functioned as a set of medicinal sunglasses, deflecting the desert glare. The lead-based minerals in the pigment also triggered a localized immune response, helping the eyes fight off infections caused by blowing dust. During celebrations, guests wore scented cones of animal fat on their wigs. As the day warmed, the fat softened and coated the body in oils, moisturizing the skin and neutralizing body odor in the dry, harsh climate. Egyptian style was a byproduct of biology. Looking beautiful was the visual result of choosing fabrics and minerals that kept you alive in the heat. While desert life was about the sun, city life was about the stench. Ancient and medieval urban centers were packed with livestock and human waste, creating an inescapable heavy odor. To medical minds, smell was a weapon. This was the miasma theory. Foul odors transmitted disease through the air. Because bad air caused sickness, the wealthy built barriers of good air. They applied heavy perfumes and carried lavender as a medical shield against a lethal environment. Fear of miasma persisted until urban engineering provided a physical solution. Large-scale sewer systems finally removed the source of the odors, replacing perfume with proper sanitation. The modern fragrance industry is rooted in this survival instinct, a legacy of when breathing safely was a luxury reserved for the few. As technology advanced, these biological threats began to recede. Modern refrigeration, plumbing, and antibiotics eventually solved the environmental problems our ancestors faced. Feast cycles, heavy makeup, and scented oils began as clever responses to scarcity, climate, and disease. Yet the behaviors persisted.
Cultural symbols of wealth and status remained permanent fixtures of human psychology long after the life or death necessity for them had passed. We still see these echoes today. A morning makeup routine, a designer perfume, or a lavish dinner party are all fragments of these ancient survival mechanics. Modern luxury is the preserved legacy of ancient survival. It proves humanity's most enduring art form is the clever, constant act of staying alive.
Today, laboratories run poison drinks through mass spectrometers, and doctors prescribe targeted antibiotics. But step back a few centuries, and that safety net completely vanishes. For the vast majority of human history, the mechanics behind sudden death were entirely invisible. Urban disease, the logistical nightmare of thousands of people living on top of each other, and sudden political assassinations were not solvable equations. They were terrifying, random forces that struck without warning. Societies existed in a perpetual vacuum of knowledge. Lacking the microscopic lenses or chemical tests we rely on, ancient and historical communities hovered constantly on the edge of collapse, forced to navigate threats they could not even see. To survive that darkness, they engineered complex physical systems to filter out danger. These solutions were often deeply unpleasant, incredibly visceral, and enforced by rigid social hierarchies that dictated exactly who had to put themselves in the line of fire. We tend to look back at these practices and write them off as weird history or backward superstition. In reality, these bizarre customs were their version of hard science, calculated mechanisms designed to force order onto a chaotic world. Consider the streets of Tudor London. Thousands of people packed into cramped neighborhoods produced a daily mountain of human waste. With zero modern plumbing or underground sewer infrastructure, the city faced a literal, suffocating environmental crisis that threatened to swallow the capital. The civic response fell squarely on the shoulders of the lower class. Enter the gong farmer. Working under the cover of darkness to avoid complaints about the smell, these laborers spent their nights standing waist-deep in overflowing cesspits, shoveling out the city's raw sewage by hand. Follow that exact same biological necessity to the absolute peak of the social pyramid, and the sanitation economy flips. Inside the royal palace, managing human waste was not a punishment for the destitute. It was a highly coveted job. The groom of the stool was responsible for the king's portable toilet. While ambitious nobles waited outside for days hoping for a brief audience, the groom spent quiet, private minutes with the monarch every single day. In the cut-through Tudor court, proximity was power, and managing the royal bathroom routine was a fast track to immense political influence. Without civic infrastructure to flush problems away, wading into the waste was an essential function of the state. Whether you were a peasant trying to survive the night shift or an aristocrat securing royal favors, dealing directly with human excrement kept the entire Tudor machine running. Thousands of years earlier, the invisible threat was human biology. Giving birth in the ancient world carried an exceptionally high risk of death for both mother and child, a danger compounded by a total lack of antibiotics or surgical intervention. To combat this biological lottery, ancient Egyptians turned the human body itself into a permanent shield. Pregnant women applied specific sacred ink designs onto their abdomens and thighs, effectively using tattoos as functional medical amulets that couldn't be dropped or lost. Because mummified skin darkens and wrinkles over millennia, these markings remained hidden from early archaeologists. It took modern infrared imaging to cut through the discoloration and reveal carefully arranged, highly intentional protective patterns inked across the women's bodies. Among the most prominent figures found in these tattoos is Bes. With a fiercely intimidating appearance, Bes was deliberately chosen to scare away invisible, malicious forces, acting as an aggressive, supernatural guardian over the household, mothers, and the delivery room. Researchers also discovered the Wedged eye, or Eye of Horus, interwoven into these permanent designs. Egyptians associated this specific geometry with profound fueling and restoration, placing it on the skin to invoke active defense exactly where the body was most vulnerable. These women were not collecting decorative body art.
By permanently etching these icons over their abdomens, they were donning the strongest medical armor their society could construct, fighting invisible biological threats with permanent, localized protection. Fast forward to the courts of Renaissance Europe, and the fear becomes entirely human. To screen their meals, anxious monarchs implemented a brutally direct testing protocol: human food tasters. By forcing a servant to eat a portion of the meal first, the elite transformed a living, breathing person into a biological warning system. When human tasters weren't enough, paranoia fueled a massive, lucrative market for exotic countermeasures. Wealthy buyers paid staggering fortunes for what they believed was unicorn horn, confident it could neutralize toxins. In reality, they were purchasing the long, spiraled tusks of Arctic narwhals brought in by trade networks. If the horn failed, rulers turned to the bezoar stone. They would drop this object into their wine, trusting it to draw out poison. What they were actually drinking from was a hardened, calcified mass extracted from the digestive tracts of animals, dressed up in gold and silver to look like a medical marvel. None of these expensive talismans offered genuine chemical protection. Unable to measure or extract the toxins threatening them, the elite purchased a psychological sense of security, building elaborate physical barriers against an enemy they couldn't see. Outside the dining hall, ancient societies faced another invisible logistical problem: data preservation. Maintaining a civilization requires storing massive amounts of legal precedent, religious doctrine, and astronomical observation. But securing that data without written encyclopedias or digital servers requires extreme methods. The Celtic Druids solved this by treating the human brain as a hard drive. To protect their sacred knowledge, they explicitly banned writing it down. Instead, initiates underwent an exhausting educational regime, spending up to 20 years mentally conditioning themselves to perfectly memorize vast datasets of cultural law and spiritual traditions. Our deepest insights into this intense oral tradition actually come from the people actively trying to destroy it. Roman military commanders, particularly Julius Caesar, heavily documented the Druids' immense commitment to memory, leaving us a record from the viewpoint of a hostile invader. By weaponizing memory, the Druids constructed an unhackable, entirely exclusive database. If you needed to settle a property dispute or interpret a celestial event, you couldn't consult a scroll. You had to consult a Druid, securing their position of absolute authority over Celtic society. On the surface, paying for a piece of animal stomach, etching religious geometry directly into your skin, shoveling Tudor sewage in the dead of night, and spending 2 decades memorizing unwritten laws seem completely unrelated. Look closely at this diagram, mapping out these historical systems. The unifying logic becomes brutally clear. In a world devoid of modern technology, the human body itself had to serve as the primary machine for survival. It became the filter for civic waste, the canvas for medical defense, the chemical testing kit, and the civilization's hard drive. The system worked because it was relentless. By funneling these terrifying invisible threats through intense physical sacrifice, societies created a continuous loop of control, forcing order over environments that otherwise would have completely overwhelmed them. The strange jobs and stomach-turning rituals of the past were never foolishness. They were the essential, hard-won survival mechanisms of their eras. When faced with the terrifying unknown, humanity has always been willing to endure whatever visceral extremes are necessary to conquer the dark.
You arrive home, drop your bag, and sink onto the couch. The climate control is perfectly set, dinner was delivered directly to your door, and an endless library of entertainment glows right in front of you. Then your phone vibrates. It is a message from your manager asking a quick question about a spreadsheet. Instantly, he possessed a genuine, unbreakable off switch. We assume technological progress automatically leads to an easier life. By removing physical friction, we built a highly comfortable world. But that same physical friction served a purpose. It acted as a natural boundary, and without it, the line between rest and labor has completely dissolved. For most of human history, nature dictated the schedule. Daylight determined when agricultural work could happen, and a frozen winter field forced a seasonal pause. Nature was an uncompromising manager with no interest in quarterly targets. Labor was entirely task-based. If a field needed plowing, your goal was simply to finish the field. Once the soil was turned, you stopped. Nobody measured whether it took exactly 8 hours. This diagram shows how that relationship shifted. Instead of following a fluid cycle tied to the sun, the day was sliced into rigid, identical blocks. With the invention of the mechanical clock, workers began selling specific portions of their time rather than the completion of a physical task. The factory formalized this system. Production required workers to leave their homes, arrive at precise times, and maintain pace with untiring machinery. The workload no longer rose and fell with the seasons. Long before the factory, wealthy Romans understood this relationship between time and status. Elite citizens deliberately ate their meals reclining on cushioned couches. Lying down to eat is highly inefficient, and that was the point. It proved you were insulated from the pressures of labor, with hours to spare and servants to manage the physical effort. Over centuries, humanity systematically defeated the limitations of darkness and seasonal weather. We used that victory to build regimented systems where biological cues to stop working are ignored, locking us into a schedule that never naturally ends. Distance used to be a formidable physical barrier. A journey requiring 2 hours by car today took days on foot or horseback. Travelers relied on scattered monasteries or the charity of complete strangers simply to find shelter before nightfall. On the road, privacy was virtually non-existent. Finding an inn often meant sharing a single straw mattress with unknown merchants or pilgrims, a necessary compromise to stay warm and protect your belongings from theft. This intense geographic concentration forced people together. The local tavern functioned as the center of social life, a place to share news, drink ale, and gather with neighbors. You were deeply connected to your community, but entirely offline. That spatial friction was a powerful productivity barrier. If the manor steward needed you after hours, he had to physically walk out and find you. Distance itself was the ultimate boundary protecting your time. These towering stone walls form the ruins of the Baths of Caracalla in Rome. Their massive scale illustrates how ancient hygiene was a sprawling, multi-stage leisure event rather than a rapid daily chore. Bathing meant moving through differently heated rooms, exercising, and spending hours away from daily tasks. Look closely at the open spaces built into the layout. These were designed specifically for people to gather, discuss business, and share gossip. Cleanliness was a deeply social activity. By the late Middle Ages, physicians blamed diseases on miasma, corrupted air, leading people to fear that warm bathwater would open their pores to infection. Instead of full-body immersion, respectable cleanliness meant scrubbing the face and regularly changing into fresh white linen to absorb sweat. The connection between hygiene and health became starkly literal in the 19th century. Germ theory redefined dirt as deadly, proving that massive clean water infrastructure was a strict public health necessity. Scientists like Louis Pasteur proved that invisible microorganisms were responsible for transmitting illness, overturning centuries of medical assumptions. Physicians such as Joseph Lister applied this understanding to create antiseptic environments in medicine, driving a societal push for sterilized, protected spaces. Modern indoor plumbing eradicated waterborne plagues and extended human lifespans, but it also moved bathing entirely behind closed doors. The routine of getting clean became a highly efficient, solitary task, quietly stripping away another pocket of communal downtime. We have achieved an astounding victory over our physical environment. We illuminated the dark, collapsed geographic isolation with instant communication, and engineered systems to wash away microscopic pathogens. We enjoy freedoms our ancestors couldn't fathom. We aren't bound to the mandatory labor of a feudal lord, and a simple winter infection is no longer a probable death sentence. But removing the friction of the physical world did not generate rest. It simply expanded our capacity for continuous work.
The medieval peasant rested because the sun forced him to, and because his village was too remote for outside demands to reach him. Today, the sun has no authority over a brightly lit office, and an ocean of distance offers zero protection from an incoming email. Nature will no longer tell you when the workday is over. The limits that used to be built into the fabric of the physical world are gone. Now, the responsibility to enforce those boundaries, to actively choose to stop, falls entirely on you. Look at this room. Modern society tells us this is the ultimate peak of human productivity. We expect rigid schedules, designated workspaces, and hours of uninterrupted focus. But if sitting quietly at a desk is the only way for humans to operate, we have a historical math problem to solve. Some of history's most dominant societies thrived by behaving in ways that would get you fired today. Think of history as an ecosystem. To understand success, we have to look past our own standards and ask what the specific environment actually demanded of the people living in it. The value of any human trait, behavior, or innovation is defined entirely by its practical utility in its immediate surroundings. Picture a 9th century Scandinavian coastline. A sudden storm hits the prow of your ship. There are no fixed schedules here. The weather turns deadly without warning, and your daily tasks pivot by the hour. In a modern office, a restless, novelty-seeking brain is classified as a disorder, ADHD. In the Viking world, where predictability did not exist, those exact traits acted as distinct survival advantages. A brain wired for distraction becomes a highly effective scanning engine. It picks up the subtle shift in the wind, the behavior of seabirds, or an encroaching threat long before anyone else. When survival required it, like forging a weapon or navigating a squall, that same restless mind could lock into a state of intense, high-stakes hyperfocus, completely absorbed by the immediate problem. Viking society rewarded these scanning minds. Survival in their chaotic ecosystem favored rapid, flexible adaptation over quiet conformity. These deep-sea vessels carried the Norse far beyond their fjords, forcing them to establish authority and negotiate with foreign strangers across Europe. To secure those deals, they relied on specific grooming tools. They carried hand-carved bone combs, kept safely inside custom protective cases, everywhere they traveled. They valued these tools so highly that when a tooth snapped off, they patiently repaired the bone rather than throwing the comb away. Grooming was a daily necessity. In a world without official credentials, physical appearance served as a functional resume. Good hygiene was a pragmatic tool for projecting power and trustworthiness to potential allies. Further south, ancient civilizations faced a completely different environmental pressure, the megacity. Behind these massive brick walls, tens of thousands of strangers, laborers, and merchants were suddenly packed into the same dense space. With that population boom came an organized commercial sex trade. The Babylonian state formally acknowledged this as an economic reality and folded it into the law. These carved laws explicitly recorded property and inheritance rights for these workers, integrating them into the legal landscape. Centuries later, the Roman Empire refined this approach. Inside functional spaces like this, brothel in Pompeii, the government actively licensed workers and collected taxes on the trade. The ancient megacity prioritized tax revenue and public order over moral ideals. In these dense urban environments, societal laws eventually bent to accommodate inescapable human nature. Fast forward to Paris, 1889. The city was defined by elegant stone architecture. The proposal to build a 300-meter iron structure hit the public as a severe visual shock. Prominent artists and citizens launched a fierce backlash. They condemned the design as a hideous factory chimney, an industrial stain ruining their historic skyline. The contract explicitly stated the tower would stand for only 20 years before being demolished and sold for scrap metal. Gustave Eiffel saved his creation by pivoting to pure utility. He transformed the tower into an irreplaceable hub for high-altitude scientific observation, and later a massive military radio antenna. The tower survived because it adapted to the demands of the industrial age. It became far too functionally valuable to tear down. The restless Viking brain, the meticulously groomed Norse trader, the taxed ancient brothel, the despised Iron Tower. These examples all defied the proper or normal expectations of their time. They were outsiders to the prevailing ideals of their societies. But history shows that survival belongs strictly to what is most adaptable. Whether it is a human trait, a structure, or a law, utility is what determines what stays and what goes. This suggests that the wrong trait is often just a trait in the wrong place. Lasting success happens when we move past trying to fit a rigid mold and instead find or build an environment that requires exactly what we already offer.
Today, getting away with murder is astonishingly difficult. You leave behind a dense web of digital footprints, DNA evidence, and surveillance footage. The modern world is rigged to ensure you are caught. 800 years ago, if a traveler vanished on a muddy track between two isolated villages, nobody launched a manhunt. Neighbors simply assumed the winter weather was harsh, or the local wolves had been unusually productive that week. We often imagine the medieval world overflowing with monsters, but the human brain hasn't changed. The percentage of people born without empathy, those we classify as psychopaths, was exactly the same then as it is right now. The medieval landscape lacked systemic guardrails, unintentionally creating an environment where nature itself effectively erased the evidence of a crime. The medieval world failed to track human behavior on an almost comical scale. There were no central police forces. Record-keeping was wildly inconsistent, and villages existed in profound isolation. This created an enormous blind spot. A prolific killer could commit atrocities, walk 50 miles down the road, invent an entirely new name, and instantly erase his past. Curious, shifting focus, to see a radically different approach, look at these stone foundations along Rome's northern frontier. This was an environment built on organic, unavoidable accountability. The harsh realities of the frontier forced deeply diverse groups, Roman soldiers, native Britons, and Gaulish merchants, into strict interdependence. Surviving the elements and enemy raids required relying heavily on your neighbors. The written records found here, like these wooden tablets, prove these blended communities maintained constant communication and shared commerce. People kept track of each other. Survival on the frontier demanded relying on your neighbors, creating a structural check on predatory behavior that isolated medieval roads lacked. Returning to medieval Europe, we find the ultimate failure of accountability perched on a steep hill. In the feudal system, the law belonged to whoever owned the fortress. When an individual lacking empathy inherited this kind of unchecked authority, his cruelty and violence were masked as lawful noble privilege. The Byzantine Empire faced the same threat of ambitious, violent men seeking power, but sitting atop the institutional wealth of Constantinople, the state engineered a system to cage them. The emperors recruited ruthless Viking warriors to serve as the elite Varangian Guard, successfully leashing their aggression through strict, oath-bound loyalty to the emperor alone. This obedience was purchased and maintained through immense, reliable wealth. The empire paid its guards in solid gold coins, ensuring that staying loyal was more lucrative than causing trouble. While medieval lords used unaccountable power to exploit the weak, the Byzantine system used extreme wealth and rigid honor codes to structurally manage their most dangerous assets. Psychopaths rely on exploiting societal trust. In the Middle Ages, traveling holy men could manipulate isolated populations by using the fear of damnation to demand food, shelter, and money. In Viking Scandinavia, this dynamic shifted. Trust was not an abstract concept, but a communal bond required to survive in the north. The lethal nature of northern winters made communal harmony a matter of life and death. When the sea froze and the sun disappeared, no one survived alone. Viking seasonal festivals functioned as structural mechanisms designed to reinforce communal trust.
settle legal disputes, and bind families together over shared resources. To a Viking, breaking communal trust meant freezing or starving, but to a medieval psychopath operating in a fragmented society, blind communal trust was simply an invitation to prey. The predator's paradise eventually fell apart, but it was dismantled by the slow, boring rise of bureaucracy rather than grand battles. As centralized kingdoms emerged, royal judges began traveling further. Standardized records of land ownership and criminal cases began to systematically close the loopholes of anonymity. Growing commerce demanded safer streets and stricter regulations. Cities organized night watches, and merchants demanded accountability for better business. As society became interconnected, it became significantly harder to manipulate others in the dark. Human nature has never received a software update. The exact same dangerous personalities that haunted muddy medieval roads still exist in modern society today. Psychopaths identify weaknesses in a society's architecture that everyone else ignores, and they quietly turn those gaps into opportunities. The modern bureaucracies, digital trails, and complex laws we often complain about are actually our greatest structural armor. They create the friction that keeps predators from operating freely. Civilization removes the camouflage that once allowed predators to thrive. Our everyday safety relies entirely on this invisible architecture of accountability locking into place. Imagine waking up in ancient Athens, surrounded by the warmth of a Mediterranean morning, yet feeling crushed beneath an invisible weight. You aren't sick, and you aren't grieving, but every step feels like carrying a sack of stones uphill. It is an injury you cannot point to. Today, we recognize these symptoms as depression, but the Greeks lacked the tools to map the chemistry of a living brain, or use satellite imagery to define the borders of their continent. Rather than yielding to mystery, these thinkers developed systematic ways to map what they couldn't see. By attempting to measure the unseeable, these early civilizations established the foundational methods we use to navigate human psychology and the physical world today. Greek physicians defined this heavy despair as melancholia. Their theory centered on the four humors, biological fluids that governed health. They believed an excess of black bile physically darkened the mind, dragging a person into hopelessness. These are oxidized bronze medical tools, a physical record of the instrument-driven approach Greeks took to healing. Rather than relying on magical cures, physicians used observation to prescribe diet, routine, and exercise to restore biological balance. This stone structure at Epidaurus shows the massive scale of ancient healing centers. At these sanctuaries, rest and dream analysis were treated as valid medical interventions, moving the treatment of the mind into a specialized civic space. Their biology of black bile was incorrect, but their methodology revealed a profound connection between the body and the mind, one that still dictates how we treat emotional suffering today. The drive to map the truth soon moved from the individual to the state. When the Oracle of Delphi claimed no one was wiser than Socrates, the philosophers set out to investigate the statement. This diagram illustrates the Socratic method in action. Socrates didn't provide definitions. He asked questions until the assumed knowledge of a politician or poet collapsed into contradiction. After a devastating war, Athens viewed this public exposure of ignorance as a threat. The city accused Socrates of corrupting the youth, leading to a trial ending in execution. Socrates demonstrated the quest for truth requires admitting what you do not know, making intellectual humility a necessary, if dangerous, part of the human experience. This map shows the traditional concept of the Silk Road as a single line, but the history was much more complex. The reality was a shifting network of thousands of pathways. Hidden kingdoms functioned as middlemen, passing goods and ideas through mountains and vast deserts. In regions like Bactria, Greek veterans of Alexander the Great's campaigns lived alongside Indian monks and Persian merchants, creating a physical merger of distant cultures. This Buddha statue provides visual evidence of that fusion. Notice the Greek-influenced facial features and idealized drapery of the robes, inherited directly from the Mediterranean. This temple at Dunhuang, built directly into the cliffside, reveals the architectural scale of these remote outposts. Inside, monks archived thousands of manuscripts, preserving the knowledge of entire civilizations. These oasis cities were the engines of ancient exchange, proving that human progress relies on the constant, radical flow of ideas at the edge of the unknown. These earthen ruins are the physical remains of a once great crossroads. Eventually, the Greek theories failed. Socrates was silenced, and the Silk Road kingdoms were swallowed by shifting sands. History moves forward when people invent the right questions, long before they find the right answers. We still use lifestyle interventions to examine our minds, critical thinking to challenge our leaders, and a vast digital network to connect our world. Our tools have evolved from bronze and marble to servers and MRIs, but the methodology of curiosity remains the same. The drive to map the invisible and connect the unknown has never changed.
Think of the Middle Ages, and you probably picture a miserable peasant shivering in ankle-deep mud, doctors confidently applying leeches, and panicked kings relying on doomed food tasters to survive dinner. It makes for highly entertaining television, but it relies on the flawed assumption that people born 1,000 years ago lacked basic common sense. Examine the historical records, and a different reality emerges. Across centuries, communities engineered highly structured social and economic networks to navigate the extreme physical dangers of daily life. To actually understand our ancestors, we have to stop looking for primitive behavior and start examining the hidden survival architectures they built. Take the medieval peasant. Popular culture suggests they owned nothing but the clothes on their backs. The physical evidence reveals people who managed generational wealth with careful strategy. Wealth was measured in tangible labor. An iron cooking pot or a properly forged axe required miners, charcoal burners, and skilled blacksmiths. These tools were heavily protected, multi-generational investments that guaranteed a family's ability to eat, repair their home, and endure harsh winters. This manuscript illustration highlights another cornerstone of their economy: livestock. A peasant's animals were a living, diversified portfolio. Cows provided steady dividends of milk and cheese, while oxen served as the heavy machinery required to scale up crop production. The land itself was managed through a highly calculated approach known as open field strip farming. Instead of owning one large block of acreage, a single family cultivated dozens of narrow plots scattered across the entire village map. While walking between these scattered plots sounds wildly inefficient, it solved a critical problem. If a localized flood turned the lower fields into a swamp, a family still had wheat growing safely on higher, well-drained ground. By distributing physical assets across different microclimates, the village ensured that localized bad weather wouldn't push any single household into absolute starvation. They designed a resilient agricultural economy to prevent absolute ruin. Economic security meant very little without biological survival. For everyone from kings to farmers, producing a healthy generation to inherit the land or the throne created immense social and political pressure. When couples faced infertility or sudden illness, they turned to humoral theory. This was the foundational medical framework of the era, operating on the belief that human health depended entirely on balancing four internal qualities: heat, cold, moisture, and dryness. This manuscript page shows how deeply structured this medical approach actually was. These circular diagrams detail various fetal positions, demonstrating a systematic, analytical attempt to map human anatomy and find observable metrics for biological failures. University-trained physicians provided the underlying philosophy, but alongside this theoretical framework, you see the integration of practical care. Local midwives contributed decades of first-hand observation, guiding the physical realities of pregnancy and recovery. Together, they prescribed highly specific routines. Patients followed strict dietary regimens, took carefully prepared herbal baths, and tracked environmental factors to adjust their body's temperature and moisture. The true value of this medical system was providing a rational framework and actionable hope, allowing people to survive the psychological toll of biological uncertainty. At the highest levels of society, that biological uncertainty included the threat of assassination. For a Tudor monarch, the primary challenge of a banquet was trust. They needed to know the meal wasn't a death sentence. In reality, the monarchy protected itself with paperwork and logistics. The royal kitchen operated as a heavily supervised bureaucracy. Departments were strictly compartmentalized. The buttery handled ale, the cellar managed imported wines, and the pantry oversaw bread. From the moment a roast left the fire, it followed a rigid chain of custody. As the dish moved closer to the royal dining chamber, the number of people handling it decreased. Finally, a gentleman carver prepared the meat in full public view. Secretly introducing poison required bypassing dozens of scheduled checkpoints and hundreds of watching eyes. The crown achieved security by making the logistics of murder nearly impossible. Fast forward to early 20th century Imperial Russia, and we find a social system suffocating under its own rules. The aristocracy lived within an incredibly rigid framework, where every conversation was governed by strict etiquette and constant public scrutiny. Grigory Rasputin functioned as an authentic emotional relief valve, bypassing the suffocating rules of high society. He ignored social rank, spoke directly to noblewomen, and offered genuine emotional attention during a time when honest conversation was a rare luxury. But his rise to true power stemmed from a profound systemic failure. The heir to the throne, Tsarevich Alexei, suffered from hemophilia. Even a minor bruise could become fatal, and the finest university-trained doctors in the empire were entirely powerless to stop the bleeding. When every medical expert admitted defeat, Rasputin offered the one thing Empress Alexandra required: calm reassurance. Whether through reducing the boy's anxiety or simply telling doctors to stop prescribing blood-thinning aspirin, his interventions seemed to yield actual results. As the Empress relied on him more heavily, his presence mutated in the public eye. The holy man stood as a living symbol of the empire's internal collapse to a public already anxious about its political future. Rasputin's influence resulted from a high-stakes, helpless system, desperately trying to manage an uncontrollable threat. He filled the void left by a failing medical system, answering the desperation of parents who had run out of worldly options. Look across these centuries, and a single pattern connects these artifacts. A peasant's iron axe, a physician's anatomical chart, a Tudor kitchen bureaucracy, a mystic's prayer in St. Petersburg are all manifestations of the exact same instinct. Human intelligence hasn't suddenly evolved over the last millennium. Historical people evaluated risk, managed assets, and structured their societies with the same calculation as a modern venture capitalist or security analyst. They simply utilized the tools available in their era. The people of the past didn't survive by accident. They survived because they engineered invisible, sophisticated systems that kept their families fed, their monarchs safe, and their sanity intact against overwhelming odds. Modern religious traditions often give us perfect moral examples. The ancient Greeks gave us an immortal, unimaginably powerful, and breathtakingly selfish family living at the summit of a hostile mountain. It feels contradictory. The same civilization that developed democracy, advanced mathematics, and early philosophy also worshipped a pantheon of rulers defined by their deception, jealousy, and complete lack of emotional maturity. But the Olympians were never written as instruction manuals for proper behavior. To the ancient Greeks, these beings represented the literal forces of the natural world. Nature can nourish a harvest one day and destroy it with a flood the next. By magnifying human flaws to a cosmic scale, the Greeks built a symbolic framework to explain a universe that is unpredictable, dangerous, and often deeply unfair. This bronze statue of Poseidon captures the physical weight of that idea. Like his brother Zeus, the ruler of the sea was driven entirely by appetite and impulse. They were the literal embodiments of sudden thunderstorms and violent ocean currents. When those unstoppable natural desires
intersected with the lives of ordinary mortals, the results were almost always devastating. Mortals routinely became collateral damage in the gods' endless rivalries and pursuits. You can see the distress in this stone carving of Medusa. Early traditions describe her as a mortal priestess who caught Poseidon's attention. After their encounter inside Athena's temple, Athena transformed Medusa into a monster. She was punished for a situation she had no power to prevent. Divine justice frequently misfired in exactly this way. Hera, the queen of the gods, almost never punished Zeus for his countless affairs. Instead, her revenge fell upon the powerless mortals who stood within her reach. Mount Olympus operated as a monopoly, where power existed completely without accountability. Because the gods made the rules, they were exempt from following them, leaving humanity to endure the consequences. The danger of the gods extended well beyond their anger. Look at the carefully ordered geometry of this ancient pottery vessel. It reflects the structured, predictable life of a young folkloric potter named Thalia, at least until she attracted divine generosity. During a rare festival, Aphrodite disguised herself as an old woman and gifted Thalia a magical crimson veil. The fabric guaranteed its wearer endless, overwhelming admiration from every person who saw her. Soon, wealthy princes and passionate poets and traveling merchants crowded her village with marriage proposals. But an ocean of superficial desire drowned out any real connection. Surrounded by hundreds of identical, obsessive compliments, Thalia completely lost the ability to identify genuine affection. For the ancient Greeks, proximity to the divine carried immense risk. A gift from an absolute power usually functioned as a deeply isolating curse in disguise. If the gods' actions are so destructive and their gifts are so toxic, the logical response would be to remove them from the equation entirely. That is exactly what a mortal weaver named Myrto attempted to do. Sitting on the cliffs of Thessaly, she decided to capture Boreas, the volatile north wind, by weaving the movement of the air itself into a silver-threaded tapestry. This carving shows Boreas trapped entirely in stone, much like he became trapped in Myrto's loom. When the fabric finally absorbed the wind's immortal essence, the northern gales immediately went silent. The immediate aftermath felt like a utopia. The Aegean Sea turned perfectly smooth. Merchant ships no longer feared violent storms, and coastal villages stopped losing their fishermen to sudden squalls. Human ingenuity had successfully neutralized the universe's most volatile variable, creating a safe, peaceful, and predictable world. But that perfect calm quickly began to suffocate the lands it was supposed to protect. This animated map of the Greek water cycle shows exactly what went wrong. Heavy rain clouds gathered over the western sea, but without the north wind to push them, the weather systems stalled entirely over the ocean. Meanwhile, large trading vessels sat motionless in the harbor, unable to sail. The massive wooden sails of windmills stood frozen, halting the production of flour. Without rain moving inland, rivers shrank and agricultural fields turned brown. Aeolus, the keeper of the winds, soon arrived at Myrto's workshop to explain her mistake. The violent gales that occasionally sank ships were the exact same currents required to carry rain to the crops and keep the planet breathing. Greek mythology never intended to provide a moral compass. It offered a sophisticated lens for accepting reality. The chaotic, destructive, and seemingly unfair elements of nature are not a flaw in the design of the universe. They are the system itself. We often imagine our ancestors as a line of miserable subjects, endlessly obedient to the kings and gods that ruled them. But the reality is far more complex. These civilizations were built on strict hierarchies, where the wrong word could mean ruin. Human nature inherently rejects that kind of total control. People require an outlet, a pressure valve, where they can reclaim a sense of levity and autonomy just to survive. The choice to manage this pressure, or attempt to ignore it, led to very different outcomes. Depending on how that valve was handled, these moments of subversion could result in a massive citywide celebration, a diplomatic incident, or a hidden struggle for survival. Ancient Rome represents the most organized approach. Instead of fighting the human need for subversion, the state institutionalized it during festivals like Saturnalia. For 1 week in December, the hierarchy inverted. Masters served meals to their own slaves, and the strict codes of conduct that governed the city were intentionally paused. To see the scale of this state-sanctioned release, we have to look at the footprint of the Circus Maximus. This wasn't a local arena. It was a massive stadium designed to hold over 100,000 people at once. This mosaic captures the obsession that drove those crowds. Chariot racing provided a controlled public outlet for aggression, allowing citizens to pour their frustrations into cheering for their racing faction as horses hurtled around the track. Not all release was chaotic. During the Vestalia, women were granted temporary access to the restricted Temple of Vesta, finding a sacred, quiet moment of autonomy within the city's most protected religious space. By allowing these massive, temporary bursts of freedom, the Roman state ensured that the rigid class system remained unchallenged for the rest of the year. But move to medieval Europe, and that state-sanctioned release vanishes. Without a formal outlet, the extreme social rigidity made every interaction feel fragile. This illuminated manuscript of a royal banquet highlights the tension. Every plate and seat broadcasted a person's exact rank. In this world, a prank was rarely harmless. Moving a nobleman's goblet was viewed as a public downgrade of honor, frequently ending in drawn swords. This volatile energy was even more concentrated in university cities, where educated youth lived in insular, cloistered worlds like this one, constantly at odds with the townsfolk around them. One favorite target was the church bell tower. In the middle of the night, students would secretly ring the bells, sparking mass panic among residents who woke up convinced that their town was under attack or engulfed in flames. Because the medieval system provided no safe way to vent, these minor acts of levity and bruised egos constantly exploded into actual violence and diplomatic scandals. By the time we reach Tudor England, the stakes for subversion move inward. It wasn't just about social honor, it was about physical survival. Tudor women lived under impossible pressure. The state and the church mandated constant childbearing, even though every delivery was a deadly gamble in an era with no understanding of infection or modern surgery. Since the authorities tried to weld this pressure valve shut, women were forced to build a secret underground network to manage their own fertility. The household herb garden became their laboratory. This botanical guide shows common plants like wild rue, quietly repurposed as herbal contraceptives. Knowledge of herbs like rue and pennyroyal passed from midwife to mother in whispered conversations, bypassing male-dominated medical texts of the time. By sharing this secret information, these women reclaimed agency over their own bodies, turning their private knowledge into a tool for literal survival against a system that demanded they have no choice. Whether it was a Roman slave mocking a master, a medieval squire sabotaging a banquet, or a Tudor mother brewing tea in secret, the motivation is identical. It is the fundamental refusal to be entirely defined or controlled by the systems built around us. Official history is often a timeline of kings and conquerors, but running parallel to that is a secondary, secret history, one written entirely through these small acts of subversion. Tradition and hierarchy may have built the walls of the past, but it was humanity's relentless need for levity, agency, and survival that made it possible to live inside them.
Picture the word mad emperor. Your brain probably serves up a purple-robed lunatic feeding senators to lions for fun. We all know the greatest hits: Caligula threatening to make his favorite horse a consul, or Nero serenading himself with a fiddle while Rome burns to the ground. It is tempting to look back at these men through a modern lens and hand out clinical psychiatric labels like party favors. We categorize them as psychopaths, individuals biologically wired for cruelty, devoid of empathy, ruling an empire on pure sadistic impulse. But Rome did not have a free press. It had senators with grudges, and biographers writing decades or centuries after the bodies were already cold. When we read Suetonius or the Historia Augusta, we are essentially reading ancient tabloid gossip and scores settled by the very aristocracy these emperors terrorized. Strip away the exaggeration, and a more chilling reality remains. A structurally broken political machine turned cruelty into a job requirement, making an emperor's actual medical history almost irrelevant to the body count he left behind. The Roman Empire was built on a massive architectural illusion. Augustus designed a system that ran on absolute, one-man rule, while pretending the republic still existed. There were no constitutional succession plans, and there were no term limits. Handed total power in his early 20s, young rulers like Caligula quickly realized a grim reality. Without a legal way to remove a leader, assassination became the only mechanism for regime change. That vacuum of accountability bred an intense, rational paranoia. If anyone could kill you, your safest move was to kill them first. The empire developed an entire industry of professional informers. Dinner parties became minefields where a misplaced joke could be spun into treason, and emperors routinely executed the elite before a plot could even form. Under Nero, this survival tactic escalated into spectacle. He used public displays of violence, the execution of rivals, and eventually his own mother, as a weapon of mass intimidation. The brutality was a calculated performance designed to paralyze the aristocracy with fear. What hostile historians recorded as the unpredictable madness of early Caesars was actually a defense mechanism. In a system held together entirely by fear, these preemptive purges were the most reliable way to stay alive. By the time the empire reached its later centuries, the polite fiction of senatorial authority disappeared. The throne belonged to whoever could buy, intimidate, or command the largest army. The emperor was essentially renting his power month to month from the military. Caracalla is the ultimate textbook case of a ruler built for this exact volatile dynamic. To secure absolute control over the legions, he had his own brother murdered in their mother's arms. He then unleashed a purge that swept through the Roman elite, executing an estimated 20,000 citizens to erase anyone who might command competing loyalty from his troops. Yet the same ruler enacted massive administrative reforms. He extended Roman citizenship across the empire and funded enormous public infrastructure, like these sprawling baths in Rome, using construction to project undeniable strength. To keep those soldiers happy, emperors had to constantly raise pay and hand out massive bonuses. When the treasury ran dry, they systematically debased the silver currency, sacrificing the long-term economy to survive the current fiscal year. Caracalla's mass executions and financial recklessness served a practical, desperate purpose. They were the precise, bloody invoice required to keep a heavily armed mercenary class from deciding they liked someone else's face on the coinage better. As Rome aged and its borders fractured, the nature of imperial violence matured. It stopped looking like the personal rage of a paranoid individual and morphed into cold, formalized state policy. Diocletian rescued the empire from a half-century of chaos by redesigning its entire operating system. He also used that same administrative competence to lock generations of free peasants into hereditary serfdom and launch a systematic, empire-wide persecution of Christians. Diocletian's persecution operated with the logic of a spreadsheet. He issued a series of escalating edicts. Those orders passed to provincial governors, stamped, filed, and enforced like a tax collection. This chain of custody turned mass suffering into a legally binding procedure. Executioners and clerks followed forms filed in triplicate, making the violence highly predictable and mundane. Even Constantine, celebrated by later historians as a holy hero, utilized this calculated approach to power. Once he consolidated his reign, he quietly arrested and executed his own eldest son, and shortly after, his wife. He operated with a ruthless, bureaucratic efficiency, eliminating family members the same way he eliminated battlefield rivals. This era shifted the burden of cruelty from individuals to the institutions themselves. When mass suffering becomes a routine administrative output,
The state effectively replicates the behavior of a psychopath, but with a reach and permanence no single person could ever achieve. Over 7 centuries, the Roman throne didn't accidentally attract a continuous, unbroken line of biologically defective psychopaths. The turnover rate was simply too high for that to be a coincidence. These men rarely stood in their marble halls and thought of themselves as villains. They believed they were building eternal legacies or protecting a fragile state from circling wolves. They merely executed the brutal logic their office demanded. The problem was the architecture they inherited. Rome stripped away all legal accountability, handed out absolute authority, and staked the entire survival of the empire on the loyalty of an army backing one highly fallible human being. The so-called mad emperors of ancient Rome offer us a stark, timeless warning about what happens when institutional accountability completely vanishes. Absolute, unchecked power manufactures monsters by making cruelty the standard operating procedure for survival.